Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with the Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and just want to remind you all that if you're watching us on YouTube or listening to us either way, leave us a like, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Let your friends know, let your family members know, let your friends' family members know how much you're enjoying the lunch hour. I will certainly appreciate it. Well, we've got a great show today. We're actually breaking the mold with this one. It's the first time we're going to have on two guests at the same time. Going to be joined today by Chris Pilkerton and Jaron Smith. They've got a new book coming out. Chris Pilkerton, he's a former cabinet member, head of the U.S. Small Business Administration, serving as the acting administrator from 2019 to 2020. He was the SBA's general counsel from 2017 to 2020. In those roles, he also advocated for advanced manufacturing ecosystems as well as associated workforce development initiatives for both urban and rural areas. In 2020, he served as a White House senior policy advisor and the executive director of the White House Opportunity Now Initiative, a government-wide program to support economic empowerment for disadvantaged communities, working directly with mayors and governors on local economic initiatives. Our other guest is Jaron Smith. He served in several roles at the White House, including Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy, Deputy Director of the Office of American Innovation, and Director of Urban Affairs and Revitalization for the White House Domestic Policy Council. During that time, he led the legislative efforts to advance criminal justice reform in the First Step Act, authoring executive orders on issues related to safe policing and access to capital for minority-owned businesses, enacting the Opportunity Zones provision of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, and securing permanent funding for historically Black colleges and universities under the Future Act. They have a book coming out. It is called Underserved, Harnessing the Principles of Lincoln's Vision for Reconstruction for Today's Forgotten Communities, released in September of 2023. Gentlemen, I know it's a mouthful. Welcome to the show. It's good to have you on.
Thanks for having us.
Always. So let's talk about this issue. We have a bit of a crisis in America. And it certainly impacts the small business community, where lots of folks are talking about issues of crime and policing. We have to reach a balance between criminal justice reform, which is something that is absolutely necessary. There are powers that are being abused out there, and people are being having their lives essentially hijacked for crimes that may have been committed well in the past. But at the same time, we are dealing with issues of lawlessness, not just in America's inner cities, but in suburbs as well. This has an impact on small business. So I know we're teeing up a hard question here, but let's start there, gents. How do we reach this balance?
Well, sure. I can kick this off. I think that the approach that President Trump took is the right approach. We call his approach towards reforming the justice system our smart on crime approach. It's an approach where you focus on public safety first, and you work with law enforcement officers to reform the system. And that's what we did with the First Step Back. The focus there was lowering people's probability of returning to prison. We call that recidivism rate. If we're able to lower the recidivism rate, you can quickly impact crime. Many prisons don't set people up to return back from prison,
right,
being productive citizens. As a result, they become better criminals inside prison. And so the First Step Back had a focus on creating incentives that would encourage individuals to participate in recidivism reduction programming. And if they could prove to the Bureau of Prisons that they would lower their recidivism, they can serve some of their time at home. As a result of that, we were able to lower federal recidivism rates from 40% down to 12%. And if you look at those numbers, that's less crime that law enforcement officers have to worry about.
Right.
Individuals are now productive. That's a smart on crime approach. However, what you're seeing in the city is not anything near what we did. You've had rogue DAs that don't hold certain crimes, criminals accountable. You have very progressive legislators and city councils that have created laws that have created more of a magnet for crime. For example, if you look at like San Francisco, they increased the threshold for what's considered a felony for certain theft crimes. And so with raising that bar to like over $1,000, you had more people committing petty crimes. Or in Washington, D.C., they got rid of the pursuit policy. And so
Right.
individuals do more carjacking, or more youth crime has increased in places like Baltimore because they passed a law saying that the police can't talk to the youth. And so you have that. At the same time, some of these progressive cities have also had these campaigns to defund their police, and it has demoralized their police departments, where police departments aren't even showing up to the communities that need it most. As a result of that, what I've done is started a coalition called Public Safety Solutions for America, because we realize, just like we realized in the Trump administration, that public safety is the number one thing with revitalizing the community. Without public safety, you don't get things like economic development and access to jobs, because employers are not going to want to move
Right.
to a place where there's going to be crime. And that's what we talk about in Underserved, a practical, common sense approach that brings community and police together in order to revitalize communities. And we are championing this strategy because it's needed now more than ever.
I mean, so Crystal, I mean, let's turn to you and let's talk about the small business impact on this. You know, there was a time when small businesses created 2/3 of all new jobs in the United States. So I think we are sadly seeing that pass because of all kinds of burdens. Let's start by talking about the issues of crime. As I said, not just in America's inner cities, but elsewhere. How does this impact these small businesses? Jerron sort of teed it up there, but let's get into a little more detail on it.
Yeah, so I think you're looking at two different periods of time, right? Going back to what Jerron was talking about in 2019, when I was leading the Small Business Administration, we were focused on not just lifting up small businesses, but one of the biggest issues then was labor.
Yeah.
And so we actually had conferences after the First Step Act was passed to actually bring some of these formerly incarcerated folks into job fairs and to work with large businesses and small businesses about how they could hire these folks. So that was, really the idea of the rising tide part of what was happening in the economy during that time period. Fast forward to today, you've got small businesses that are getting ransacked by theft, these, flash mob burglaries. These are not just large businesses. These are mom and pop stores. These are people that put all their money back into
Right.
inventory. And I was just talking to a person who works at a very well-known chain of stores the other day, and they said they're going to have to remove greeting cards because so many are getting stolen.
Wow.
And when you get to that level of theft, it's really going to be impossible, particularly for the mom and pop small businesses to stay in business.
You understand, right? Greeting cards can get so much more. So they are so expensive. Now they're going to get even more expensive because they're being stolen, which is just crazy. Let's talk about this, because when I was doing radio in Baltimore for many years, this was something that would come up, and I know both of you will have thoughts on this. To me, almost invariably, it comes down to when government is making decisions about things. Are they decisions that will empower people or populations of people to act on their own behalf, or do they disempower people to act on their own behalf? I think about what's been happening in New Mexico with Governor Lujan Grisham and her executive order on firearms. Not that we need to talk about firearms necessarily, but in instances in which businesses and business owners can't do for themselves to protect themselves, or working families unable to do for themselves, make decisions for themselves. Talk about this. Either one of you wants to jump in and talk about the issue of empowerment and how communities and individuals get empowered to act on their own behalf.
Sure. So
either one.
I think that, as conservatives, we've always championed for a more limited role of the government, which puts more power in the hands of the people. Part of the reason that we wrote the book was to talk about free market ways with reforming our system in a way that empowers underserved communities. For example, for me, I tell a little bit about my personal story and underserved of how I grew up in a Democratic household. And I was mostly taught that Republicans were for the rich and that they were racist. And so many households get taught that. We're really kind of not understanding our history as a party and our North Star for where we see the role of government and why it's important to have a more limited government to empower people. But I think more and more as you see the results of increased spending and how that's had a contribution to inflation, as well as you're seeing more control over schools and more control over decisions that should be made by parents. More underserved communities are understanding on why government needs to have a limited role. And we're also understanding how we can work with the private sector to create more opportunity. And so that's what we're advocating for the book. We tell the history going back to Lincoln of how this narrative has changed over time and how politicians have kicked the can down the road on doing the things that's going to empower communities so that they have a chance at the American dream. Lincoln, he was really intending to focus on empowering, economically disadvantaged communities, whether white or black, because he came from an economically disadvantaged background. And he knew that the economic part was a key part of being a part of the American dream. However, he was assassinated before that happened. And you had Andrew Johnson, who really fumbled the football when it came to doing Reconstruction. And
that is an understatement of what. Yes.
But yeah, that's what we go over in the book. And then we had Jim Crow start, and so you had this whole narrative that really began pitting poor whites against poor blacks. Go ahead, Andrew.
Jerome, I'll ask you both this. So one of the things I'm fond of saying is that the American dream is the entrepreneur's dream, right? The idea that anybody can come to America and make whatever their dream real for doing better for themselves. But this issue, and this is, but it's going to be a pivot here, but I want you both to sort of weigh in on this. What we call, or what the left calls, institutional racism, which is a series of rules designed to keep a certain population down. A lot of this is bound up in, and to me, there's a confusion of the regulatory state, right? As government power grows and they put red tape in front of people who are at least able to handle the red tape that's in front of, I had a conversation with somebody, this is years ago, in DC. An entrepreneur had a brilliant business idea, a guaranteed moneymaker, given what he was doing. And it took him 14 months in DC to go from concept to doors opening. And it was the first 11 and a half months that were spent just going through the red tape. And he was someone who was a college graduate and someone who'd spent time in up on Capitol Hill. So he had a general understanding of the law. You have someone who's never, done anything, worthwhile. They have an idea of something they want to do, but they can't do it. It seems certainly that there's a disproportionate impact on those who are less educated in America, and some of it has to do with what's going on in the cities. But talk about this concept of red tape and so-called institutional racism. Am I wrong in saying that there's an interplay? I mean, I either one of you can jump in on that.
I think from my perspective, Milton Friedman said, governments don't learn, only people learn.
Yeah.
And when you think about going back to the idea of Lincoln, as Jerron was talking about, he did see this economic opportunity for all. Of course, he had to deal with the inhumanity of slavery. Right. In one of his early elections before the Civil War, he talked about this city of Huron, where it was a fictional city, but he envisioned the sort of port city where there was trade, there was workers, and everyone was sort of making money and living together sort of within this community. In 1862, he passed the Morrill Land Grant Act, which actually was looking more towards vocational schools and ultimately created the state school system. So he was empowering communities theoretically, regardless of race, regardless of color. And I think when you sort of look at how the things that we did when we were in the Trump administration, particularly around the Opportunity Now initiative that Jerron and I were a part of, the idea was to be spending time with the federal government, but also with state and local governments, and trying to advance those community opportunities. Because once the federal government puts its hand in those things, I think it ultimately ends up, joining that red tape piece that you're talking about. The community knows what it wants. Opportunity zones were a perfect example of that. Opportunity zones were an economic development tool. It wasn't a magic wand, but the community had to come together and say, this is what we want for our communities, the jobs, the housing, and everything associated with that.
I mean, Jerron, before you jump in here, because it's one of those things where our good friends at the Institute for Justice, they do such good work litigating on behalf of the American dream and entrepreneurship and red tape issues. One of their early cases was a case in Washington, D.C. Of a gentleman who wanted to open up a shoe shine business, but because of D.C.'s Jim Crow era anti-boot black laws, he couldn't do it without going through all kinds of training. They wound up challenging and winning. There are still these kinds of vestiges on the books elsewhere. It's part of what you guys were trying to deal with the Opportunity Now initiative. But Jerron, talk about things like that, the red tape that stands in the way of these entrepreneurs in America's inner cities.
Sure. I mean, occupational licensing reform has been something that's been on the conservatives' minds for a number of years. Even when I did advocacy work for Americans for Prosperity, we were going into localities and trying to organize with barbers, with a number of different individuals who were drastically impacted by these laws that didn't make sense. But we also understand that, like, federally, we've also created laws like Dodd-Frank that has made the compliance costs to even open up a financial institution so high that you've taken away your community banks. And as a result, you've seen less than half Black banks close or merge because they couldn't keep up with the compliance costs. And more importantly, it's hard for these financial institutions to even start to do like a simple $50,000 loan or a character loan, or things that used to exist 40, 50 years ago that made a person, that gave a person with a vision to maybe go to this bank and get a loan and get a business started. Which is why Chris and I really champion for capital access. We did some work with Bob Johnson and Robert Smith in order to try to figure out, as well as Ice Cube, to figure out how do we create more capital access. And historically, we know that the federal government has played a role in creating these disparities. If you look at the historic nature of redlining neighborhoods, that's part of the reason why we have concentrated poverty all across the nation. And that is the vestige of if you had to call anything institutional, that's the vestige of what happened from that. However, our country's grown, and two things can happen at once. It's still allowed for individuals like Barack Obama to become president. You have a number of African-American Fortune 500, Fortune 100 CEOs, all of the things that we take for granted as Americans are right at our footsteps, only if we kind of step up to the opportunity. And what we're trying to do is just create more opportunity for those underserved communities, because many of the issues that we're dealing with aren't just racial in nature. Like when you talk about concentrated poverty and access to capital, that affects both Black neighborhoods and poor white neighborhoods, as well as poor Hispanic neighborhoods. Which is why we wrote a book called Underserved, because we realized that there's nuanced solutions for each of these communities. And we also don't want to continue on making promises that we're going to fix the disparity issues and then continue to leave Americans behind, because the number one asset in America is our human capital. And if we want to be competitive in the 21st century, we must be able to invest in all of our people, no matter if you're from Appalachia, Mississippi Delta, or Detroit or Chicago.
And the book is called Underserved, Harnessing the Principles of Lincoln's Vision for Reconstruction for Today's Forgotten Communities. It was released in September of 2023. Chris, let's talk about this issue of access to capital, right? For a long time, there seemed to be a real wide gap between the left and the right, between Republicans and Democrats over the role of the SBA in terms of what it does to best help small businesses, with conservatives tending to take an approach dealing with the regulatory issues, the good work that the SBA's Office of Advocacy and the National Ombudsman for Small Business do, with the left really focusing on access to capital. In fact, during the Obama administration tried to take the Office of Advocacy and turn it into an access to capital research agency, which is not what it's congressionally charged to do. But on the other hand, there are issues with access to capital. Let's talk about what you learned as the SBA administrator, how your SBA was different in its approach from the current or the former SBA in terms of access to capital. How do we get small? And let me just add, I'm sorry, Jaron, let me also add this one. Let's remember that ultimately what the left wants in terms of access to small loans, they want literally, I'm not making this up, they want the post office to be the small loan lender of record, which is just crazy. But Chris, talk about the SBA, talk about access to capital, talk about the different approaches between your tenure and your colleagues on the other side of the aisle.
Sure. So when I joined the SBA, it was 2017. Linda McMahon was the administrator at the time. And she said that her biggest job at the SBA was to ensure it was no longer the best kept secret in government. So she traveled to all 68 district offices. She would literally call the district directors herself, personally. And I think a couple of times people didn't believe it was her. But what she was doing was she was being a CEO, right? She was being the top of that organization to ensure that the services that were being delivered, whether it was access to capital, whether it was business support, technical assistance, or workforce development assistance, were actually being delivered in a timely fashion. When I took over as the acting administrator, we continued those efforts. And as I alluded to before, the economy was different. There was more lending going on. Pivot to COVID. I was with Jaron, and we were working across the board with bank CEOs, with credit unions, and with community development financial institutions to figure out the best way to get dollars into those communities. And I think that's the message at the end of the day here. Getting dollars into those communities is really dependent on the vision of those communities. So I think the type of work that we did at the SBA was really looking across the board, because not every business needs money and not every business needs technical assistance, but ensuring that delivery was not only there, but also digital. And I think we were very forward looking. And I think the SBA really needs to continue to be doing that, particularly during a time when the Senate's talking about reauthorization, because it can't just be the old SBA.
Right, I agree with you there. It's one of those things we should talk about, the issues of access to capital. I don't know if you guys watch the TV show Billions on Showtime, but the issue of minority-owned banks serving inner-city communities was a major plot point in a recent episode of that. But again, it's TV, so they're not looking at sort of the nuances and the role that government plays in both helping and hurting these businesses. Let's talk about this for both of you. Your journey to where you are or where you were, Jaron, I want to hear about your sort of moment where you realized that how you were perceiving the world was out of step from the folks who were around you. And Chris, I want you to talk about how you came to be general counsel and acting administrator at SBA. But Jaron, let's start with you. When did you have that? Because by way of background, right, I grew up in New York. I didn't know I was always sort of a conservative Democrat growing up when I was in high school. And then I had my moments and I read David Bose's Libertarianism, a primer, and that sort of made me understand a little bit better as to what I thought. And then anyway, lots of things happened. But Jaron, how did you sort of have that journey?
So for me, it was a part of moving away from my hometown of Cleveland and moving to Washington, D.C. I moved here in 2000 as a freshman at Howard University, and it was during the Bush-Gore election. It was at that time. I think growing up in high school, I learned a lot about the Transcendentalists and Ralph Emerson, and I was really encouraged through some of his poems, like on Trust Thyself, that was the seeding I guess, of my conservative viewpoints. Also remember some of the teachers I had that just opened my eyes up to kind of not just believe whatever the media is teaching you. So
Yeah.
I had a healthy skepticism about the
Very
government
good.
before I came to Washington. But after kind of seeing it all on display, I saw Al Gore come speak at Howard and sound like a Baptist preacher,
Ah,
big time pandering. But I still voted for him. But what made me curious was he lost his own state.
yeah,
And I didn't understand that. I was like, how could you run for president and your state not support you? So that curiosity led me to getting the opportunity to work with Congressman J.C. Watts. When I met a mentor of mine who gave me the scenario of either working in a Democratic office or a Republican office. I decided to work in a Republican office because I wanted to learn more about Republicanism for
sure.
myself and the conservative cause. And after doing that internship for over a summer, I realized that rather a person was there was a Republican president or a Democratic president, the community I came from remained the same. And I thought that the party, the Republican Party, probably needed more people from those urban communities to kind of speak on behalf of that constituency to make the party better. I didn't realize, I used to tell my colleagues once I came back to Howard and started a college Republican chapter, that, hey, we need someone to help advise a president, if we have a Republican president, on how to deal with
Here,
issues
here.
underserved. And I kind of end up putting that into my future, and almost 20 years later, I did exactly that, advised the president on underserved communities. But I would even say, even back then, I wasn't yet a conservative yet.
Sure.
I didn't become a conservative until I worked for Vice President Pence a number of years later, and I got to read Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell and learn more about the economics around government. And
Yeah.
this is years after being a financial advisor and having a degree in finance. It just made more sense from an economic point of view to kind of have a more limited government. And so when we're talking about capital access, and the government's role with propping up businesses, all of that is the private sector. That's why our free markets work. Because you don't have a referee, the government picking winners and losers. It's based off of your ability to provide value. And so in our book, Underserved, we talk about this philosophy around mutual benefit. The left makes this argument many times that, like, capitalism is about one person or one entity taking advantage of another entity. And that's not what capitalism is about.
Right.
It's about mutual benefit. And we're starting to learn more about what the mutuality of capitalism and what more it can do for underserved communities. And that's the argument that we make in the book. And that's the conversation we want to have. We realize that there is a role for the government, though limited. But the government can help scale. It can speak to best practices. In some cases, they can create more carrots and sticks to help us get to a more freer market. But we can't ignore where people currently are.
Sure.
And right now, there's segments of the population that can't access capital. And so we need to have a more intentional way of freeing up that capital to be able to take advantage of the best that we have in America.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where I heard a story yesterday about the CFPB going after, yet again, folks who are trying to find innovative ways to bring access to capital to underserved markets. Chris, let's turn to you on this. Were you always passionate about small business? What's your background there? How did you come to first be general counsel and then take over as acting administrator at the SBA?
No, certainly. So I've always been passionate about small business. Father, small business owner, so it's certainly in the family. After law school, I was a district attorney in Manhattan, so saw up close and personal the impact that crime would have on a community, particularly a bustling city like New York. Then went to work at the Securities and Exchange Commission. spent time in the private sector, and was able to go to the SBA after that. And what was really fascinating for me was how all of that experience, whether it was legal, compliance, policy, how it all came together working under Lyndon
Sure.
McMahon as sort of the true CEO. I went to a Jesuit high school in DC, a Jesuit college, and there's always that "men for others" mantra that the Jesuits have, and other folks call the Jesuits God's Marines. So
Oh,
there's always
yes.
efficiency that's a part of it. So always been focused on the service component, but doing it in really efficient ways. And so we write about in the book this idea of a czar for underserved communities. One of the
Mm.
experiences that Geron and I had during the pandemic was trying to find pockets of money that hadn't been used for years and put them into different programs that were going to be immediately impactful. But in doing that, we saw that across all of these different agencies, there's siloed programs, there's siloed budgets, there's duplication. So the idea would be able to do an audit of all of these programs, bring them under one space, and make them impactful. And we believe, based on a lot of the discussions that we've had on the Hill and with others, this can be a bipartisan approach, but at its core, it's conservative in that it's efficient and not
Right.
duplicative.
It's one of those things I always come back to. One of the great failures of the Obama administration was that he really served to polarize communities around race as opposed to focusing on problems that everybody shares. But one of my favorite examples of this is abuse of power. Not that I want to go down that road, but anybody can be impacted by the abuse of power, whether it's the federal, state, or local governmental level. And if we're not sort of coming at things from a sort of shared perspective, we never solve the problems. Let me ask you this. So the book, of course, is called Underserved: Harnessing the Principles of Lincoln's Vision for Reconstruction for Today's Forgotten Communities. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about where we lost it in terms of Reconstruction, right? Where was the break where Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction just faltered and we sort of left with successive decades and generations where these communities were not having their interests served? It wasn't just Andrew Johnson. I mean, maybe it started with Andrew Johnson, but talk about where we went off the rails in terms of this vision for bringing America together and letting America prosper.
I think it really was at the point where Lincoln was assassinated. And I know that sounds pretty dramatic, but Lincoln not only had the passion for this work, the heart for this work, but the political skill to put it together. Johnson comes into office, and he was a Southerner himself, and he ended up, pardoning so many different Southerners in large part because when he was growing up, he was, not a fan of the planter class, and they had to come literally on bended knee and ask him for a pardon.
Oh boy!
Then he ended up giving the lands back. Now you had people like Thaddeus Stevens who were fighting it, and by the time President Grant, who was a general, not necessarily a politician, when he got to that period, he wasn't able to kind of turn the tide back. So then we saw decades and decades after that, so many policies that came out of the federal government. You can go all the way up to the 80s when globalization became an issue and so many jobs were being shipped away. I mean, prior to that, I think 25% of the textile workers in the South were Black. And after that, that dramatically changed and impacted communities all across that region. So the federal government really plays a role in this. But if Lincoln had been able to survive, I genuinely believe our country would be different today. But you know what? It's not too late. And that's what the book lays out.
So let's talk about today. And we had, President Trump focusing on this holistic approach and bringing people together in ways where policies are serving everybody. The Biden administration comes in. It's the Obama administration on steroids. They really hit the gas pedal on these policies that drive people apart and pick winners and losers in the marketplace. Let's talk about this and talk about why that's doomed to failure and to exacerbate these problems.
Sure. I mean, I think a big part of it is they're missing the point on what people really care about. At the same time that they're saying that they're doing things to empower people, They're not being honest about their economic agenda. They're still arguing that Biden economics policy is working, and it's not, because they're not in these communities. They're not dealing with the issues that people have, such as the cost of gas, the cost to go to the
Amen.
grocery store, the cost to pay your utilities month to month. And so you're talking about your economy is so robust, but you're not talking about the cost to live in America and how that's increased since we've had the Trump administration. So, I think that they're also missing the point on education. People don't want their teachers getting into the weeds on gender identity when a kid's in kindergarten, or having this conversation about who's privileged or not when they're in first grade, as it relates to their race. All of these things smack in the face of things that are more important, like learning math, learning reading, and at the same time, in many urban areas, our literacy rates are at an all illiteracy rates at an all time high. You have people who aren't proficient in math. I mean, you mentioned Baltimore. I think there's a number that there's dozens or tens of schools that are graduating kids where they're not even literate.
Right.
So what type of education system are we setting up? What type of economic system we're setting up? And I think that they're just not meeting the people where they are, because they are really kind of leading the movement on these cultural issues. And that's the thing that we push back at as conservatives, and we call wokeism. What we're saying is that there's real issues happening in America, and we can do something about it. And all the solutions don't require the government to play a lead role in it. These solutions require all of community, and more importantly, we need to rebuild communities. We need to work with our faith institutions, because at the heart of it, if you're thinking about crime and some of the issues that are affecting communities, we're talking about a huge behavioral health pandemic that's developing.
Right.
As you're kind of seeing generations of individuals trying to get by with trauma, and dealing with the rise of AI and social media. We need a spiritual awakening in those communities to kind of rebuild the family and rebuild community, because that undergirds everything. That resiliency, being a human being, you're going to have challenges in life.
Yeah.
When you win and you lose, but how do you pick yourself up when those things happen is extremely important. And that's the part of the America story that makes us a great country, is that we are a resilient people. But so many of our young people don't understand that history, don't understand that resiliency, and sometimes don't have that type of encouragement at home, which is why we need to invest more into rebuilding civil society. And so we talk a lot about that in the book. And that's part of the holistic approach, is realizing that, look, the government doesn't have a heart. People have a heart.
Right.
Some of our institutions have a heart for changing people's ability to be, and helping them be the best person that they can be.
Yeah, we had Pastor Corey Brooks a few months ago to talk about that out of Chicago, about that issue of the need for soul in all of this. Chris and Jaron, both of you. So Jaron mentioned the issue of mandates. I obviously spend a lot of time in the regulatory world. I can't even keep track of all the mandates that are coming down the pipeline. They said they didn't want to ban gas stoves, yet they're working to ban gas stoves and dishwashers that work and water heaters that work, and they want to bring back toilets that don't work. There's this electric vehicle mandate. They want everybody to be in an electric vehicle by, or every new car sold in America, or the majority of them by 2030, 2032, to be electric vehicles. Talk about how these mandates, either of you, both of you, talk about how these mandates impact these underserved communities, because they're the ones that get hit the hardest, aren't they?
Absolutely. So, you talk about in the Trump administration, there was the 2-for-1 rule that
Right.
For every new regulation, you had to get rid of 2. But quite honestly, I think it ended up being, we got rid of 7 or 8, for everyone when all was said and done. And even at SBA, we got rid of almost 10% of the rules that were on the regs and rules that were on the books because they were duplicative or just no longer useful. But these new regulations that you're talking about, particularly when it comes to small business, end up just being an anchor on them, right? I mean, there are regs that need to be there. There are, safety regs and things, of course, right? But when you start adding in all these different incredibly small regulations, when someone's getting, fined because there's a sign that doesn't have anything to do with safety, but it's 2 feet off the ground as opposed to 2.5 feet or what have you. That's a real fine to a small business, and that translates into their ability to invest in that business. And we talk about underserved communities actually hire workers. I'll give you a perfect example. When I was at the SBA, we had something called the franchise directory. And the franchise directory was a way for someone who wanted to open up a franchise to say, okay, I like that franchise. The SBA will fund it or will guarantee a bank's loan on that. That's great. So all of a sudden, that's done. Well, that franchise directory has been removed. And in a bipartisan fashion, the Democratic chair and the Republican ranking member of the Small Business Committee and I testified, basically said, why are you doing that? Like, there was an efficiency there.
Yeah.
And franchises are the perfect example because in many underserved communities, many small businesses start because those folks got their start as an employee there, so they understand the system.
And this gets into issues of what constitutes an independently owned business, of all kinds of rules in terms of how you count things. Just trying to make it as I'm pointing out two things. Number one, the Trump administration was the first administration in modern memory to keep the aggregate cost of regulation constant. Trump came in and regulations were costing the American economy about $2.25 trillion annually. When he left, he didn't cut the cost, but set that aside. He most importantly didn't add to those costs. And so, as opposed to right now with the Biden administration, where we're looking at $3 trillion plus, that's massive addition to the regulatory state, in that near term. And what that translates into is if you have a business with 10 employees, that's about $140,000 in regulatory costs that you're dealing with. When you're spending money on a government regulation, it's money you can't put into your business. If you have to buy a new dishwasher that's more expensive because the old one that worked just fine, you can't get parts for anymore, that's an expense you have to do. These are capital expenditures there. Listen, before I let you guys go, I've long theorized about doing a podcast called Outside Interests, where we talk about, with people who are involved in policy. You're not monofaceted. You just don't have one side. You're not just doing policy all the time. Talk about what some of your outside interests when you're not working. What are you guys up to? Jerron, I'm going to start with you. We'll finish up with you, Chris.
A big thing that I've picked back up since I have a little bit more of my time is working out. I've
Excellent.
fallen in love with it again. I've lost 30 pounds almost since I left.
Good for you.
So that's been a big thing. And being in 40 plus age, it's been a big thing to keep your mobility. So now I'm doing a lot of stretches and everything like that, and kind of relearning how my body works. But another thing that's new to me is being a parent. I had twins.
Congratulations.
Oh, thanks so much. I had twins at the beginning of the pandemic, and being a father has been a new role that I've enjoyed. And the interesting thing about being a father, it takes you back to your childhood, things that you learned,
absolutely,
things that you experience, things that you get to re-experience. We've it's the fair season, so we've been going to the Maryland, DC Fair, Virginia Fair. Children love that, and meeting the animals. And so, with doing this work, because I still have a big passion around underserved. Of course, God's only allotted me the time to kind of do the work of the people, and raise a family, and in the meantime, try to take care of myself so I can stay healthy. And so, thankful for that.
My girls are 19 and almost 19 and 21, and we were on vacation in Colorado, and we went to the Eagle County Fair and Rodeo, and they, again, at 18 and 21, they were all excited to see the animals. Chris, how about you? What are you doing when you're not doing this work? What do you, when you're not working, what are you up to?
I live out by the Chesapeake Bay,
Oh, good
and
for
I'm
you.
a relatively new transplant over the last few years. And so
Eastern Shore or Western Shore?
Eastern Shore, and
Hey!
I live in a waterman community, so I've been trying my hand at fishing and crabbing
Oh,
and
good for you.
oystering. The fishing I'm still working on it. I've got a lot of fish stories at this point, but nothing that I've really caught that's impressive.
I lived on the Eastern Shore of Maryland for 10 years, so I have great deal of love for that area. The book, gentlemen, of course, is Underserved, Harnessing the Principles of Lincoln's Vision for Reconstruction for Today's Forgotten Communities. It was released in September of this year. The authors are Jerron Smith and Chris Pilkerton. Gentlemen, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you all for joining us here as well. This has been the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Please leave us a review. Let your friends know. Let your family members know. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can catch us on every major podcast platform. If you're listening to us on one of those podcast platforms and you want to see what my guests look like, because Lord knows I know you don't want to see what I look like, check us out anyway on YouTube, the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Have a great week, everybody, and please enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.